3 in our series entitled Game Plan. In week 1, we talked about having an offensive game plan for our family, meaning how do we make a positive impact on culture? And then week 2, we moved on to the defensive side of the game and said we also have to protect our family from those most invasive and corrosive aspects of culture. Well, here in week 3, we've moved on to special teams, right? Special teams. What are special teams? Well, in a football context, special teams start the game, they start the second half, and whenever the offense of a particular team can't score a touchdown, special teams come out, either the punting team or the field goal kicking team. And there's an offensive side and a defensive side to special teams. Well, is that very important? Well, any coach worth his salt will tell you that special teams can make or break a game, even though they only average 12 to 14 plays a game. In an NFL game, there are on average about 128 total snaps from center, total plays, which means that special teams comprise only about 10% of the plays in an NFL game, and yet they have a disproportionate impact. Special teams show up on the field primarily during transitions, when a team goes from offense to defense. Well, there are family transitions as well, and I want to spend our time together today talking about parenting well by having a special teams game plan. How do we parent during the transition times in life? So let's begin by defining what a family transition is. It's specific times in the family journey when abilities and accountabilities experience significant shifts. The abilities, we're talking about the kids, that as our kids grow older and develop, their abilities change and improve. And then their accountabilities to parents change or shift. So in a family, what are those transition times specifically? Well, it's when a child is born, when a child first goes off to school or preschool, going from junior high to high school, launching off into college, and then ultimately adulting, right? Where they move into the marketplace or they get married and begin a family of their own. Those are all huge transition points. Now, here at Bay Life, every week, we always take a paragraph of scripture and unpack it. And I promise you, we're going to get there. But what I want to do on the front end of this talk is just some coaching. You see, I've been watching my parents parent for 60 years. Diane and I have been parenting for 34 years, and now we've been watching our kids parent over the last 4 years, and we've learned some things, or at least we've made some observations. So let me just throw some coaching observations at you. First of all, I want to ask and answer a simple question, and that is this. What is true of every transition? I mean, if we looked at all those different transition points in the life of one of our children, what is going to be true at every transition point? Let me step through quickly 4 things. First of all, the family unit is destabilized. Families, like any organization, we like stability. We crave rhythms. And we like to know what our lane is. And anytime you come up against one of these transition points, when your child first goes to school, or when your child is going into middle school or going off to college, you hit one of those speed bumps, those transition points, guess what? It destabilizes the family. Secondly, true of every transition point, relational connections are reevaluated. As our children go through transitions in their life, we have to constantly do what my kids, when they were in high school, called the DTR, define the relationship conversation. We have to say, okay, now that you're in middle school, What changes for you and what changes for me? Thirdly, I would say this, expectations are challenged. Both the expectations that we have as parents, that we are expecting that, well, they've gotten older, they've shifted up to the next level, and so they ought to be all that more responsible. Well, what's actually happened when they went off to middle school is just the sun came up and the sun set uh, another time. But now they're in middle school, and well, our expectations may have gone up disproportionately because they're going to a different school, and we see them differently. But in all actuality, just one more day has passed in the calendar, and their behavior may not have caught up with our expectations. But our kids have expectations as well, right? Well, now that I'm 16, I ought to have the keys to the car. Or now that I'm in college, I really don't have to listen to my parents as much as I did when I was at home. They have expectations, and we have expectations, and that can create a wedge in the family. So we have to navigate all of that. Well, one more thing, and we'll move on, and that's this. Roles have to be reordered, right? I believe there are three really significant transitions where our roles shift significantly. First is puberty, right? So maybe sometime in middle school or going into middle school. The end of high school, when they go off to college, that's a significant role shift. And then adulting. When they're on their own, they're in the marketplace, or they have married and have moved on. Our roles go from parent to peer, right? We're no longer in control. We're simply there for our counsel. The structure and authority within the family shifts. The nature of our relationship shifts. The function of how we provide counsel. All of that changes. And if we lose our way at one of those key transition points, it can have long-term negative effects. Well, that's what's happening at the transition points. The second question that we might ask is this. How do we track transition? I mean, in the life of one of our children, how do we track, are we moving fast enough? Are we moving too fast? What's going on in their life? Are they developing at an acceptable rate, or are they trying to rush things? So how do we track these transition points? And to do a kind of a self-check or a little checkup with our family at the transition points, we need to know how we're tracking. Well, transition moves along two poles or scales, right? I want to introduce you to the first one. It's kind of the north-south pole. It moves from dependence. You understand that when a child comes into the world, totally dependent on their parents, and they're moving to a time in their life when they will be completely autonomous. And over the course of their life, from birth till they're adulting, they're going to be moving at some rate of speed across that pole, right? It's really critical for us to understand that many of us as parents are geared up to do really well when they're at this end of the scale. When they're completely dependent, that's a very clarifying time. They can't clothe themselves, feed themselves, clean themselves, shelter themselves. They can't do anything for themselves. We have to do it all. Many of us as parents, and I would say specifically moms in this case, while that may be exhausting, it's very clarifying because I realize I'm totally responsible, I'm totally in control, and it leads us to kind of the impression that nothing bad can happen because I'm totally controlling my child. Well, here's the reality. Immediately after birth, and almost imperceptibly, I would say, our kids begin to move up that pole. They begin to move toward autonomy. And the big shifts are when they first go to school and they're spending several hours away from mom and dad, when they go into middle school and they have greater freedom, about the middle of high school where they can now drive and they've got a cell phone and they've got much greater autonomy, and They're moving up this scale from dependence to total autonomy. At each of these transitions, there can be trouble, right? So, as we talk about this first pole from dependence to autonomy, what are the transition trouble or the potential trouble? Well, let's talk to parents first, okay? So, maybe overprotection in the early years, right? Overprotection is when our level of care that we're giving and level of control that we're exerting is not developing rapidly enough, it can become overprotection. Or maybe a failure on our part to encourage the normal, natural speed of development. If we're not accepting and embracing the development that our child is going through, maybe it's a coddling problem, right? And we as parents, we're not quite ready for them to go off to preschool, or we're not quite ready for them to go into middle school, or I'm not sure I'm ready to say goodbye and have my child go off to college right now. And we get into the kind of that coddling mindset. Or maybe as parents, we struggle managing expectations as they're moving from dependence to autonomy. Maybe we're expecting too much in their early development days, and when a 4-year-old is running through the house and horseplay and breaks something in the house, and we're yelling at them, well, that's because we don't understand the difference between childish behavior and childlike behavior. If they're 4 and they're doing that, that's childlike. They're acting their age. Now, if your child is 14 and racing through the house and horseplay and he breaks something, or he backs one of your cars into another one of your cars when he turns 15 or 16, that's childish behavior. He's not acting his age in terms of the responsibility that he's expressing. So we have to manage our expectations, or else we end up with impossible expectations for our kids. Well, this isn't the only pole across which our kids transition. There's an east-west pole, and it's where they go from accountability to freedom. Accountability to freedom. So when they first are born and come into the family, they are completely accountable to us. What that means is they can't do anything without permission from a parent. And that is going to be true for a long time in their life. You see, it's not until they move about halfway up from dependence to autonomy, they get to this center point. When they hit that center point in terms of autonomy, then they begin to move across this scale from accountability to freedom, right? This scale then begins to move, and as they become more responsible, they hit those late elementary, middle school years, they begin to get more freedom. Now, it's freedom that we decide to give them. You know, you're being more responsible, so we're going to move your bedtime to a little later. You can stay up and hang out with the family, watch another TV show. Maybe we give them a little more freedom. Yeah, you could have an overnight at a friend's house because we trust you, because we've seen you be responsible at our house. There are a lot of things that begin to shift once a child gets from halfway on the scale from dependence to autonomy. Then they begin to move at that time toward greater freedom. A little warning about freedom. When we move toward freedom, that doesn't infer a lack of accountability. It just means that accountability is shifting from accountability directly to parents to accountability that comes from self-governance, where I begin to control myself. It's called self-control, right? As I begin to exercise some self-control. Let me also say that movement on this scale from accountability to freedom, it's not just smooth like the other one is. No, they'll gain more freedom, and then maybe they'll misuse freedom. And we have to reel it back in. And then as they establish responsible behavior again, we let it back out. So this is kind of a seesaw, a back and forth as they move from accountability all the way to freedom. What are some of the dangers that can occur through transition on this scale? Well, let's talk about our children first, right? If we're moving too fast, or if we're encouraging our kids to move too fast toward freedom, they can feel insecure. Uh, Maybe they're not ready when they turn 16 to drive a car. One of our children didn't get their license until they were 18 because they felt insecure with that particular transition. If we move things too fast, maybe they're not ready just because they turned 18 to go off to college. They may need a gap year or may need to work in the marketplace for a year and figure some things out. So if we go too fast, it creates insecurity. If we go too slow toward freedom, it can create exasperation. We have to be very careful about that. What are the troubles that parents can have as we help our children move from accountability to freedom? Well, we can be too passive. We can just check out. We can just try to let them raise themselves. We can be too permissive. Maybe you want to be their buddy or their friend rather than their parent. And so you allow too much and you just become the parent that's yes all the time. You can become a distracted parent as they move toward freedom, where you're not really investigating like you should. You're not checking where are they going on the internet? Where are they? What are they doing with their phone? Where do they go when they take the keys to the car? Who are their friends? What's happening at that party that they went to? Are their parents there? Is there alcohol present there? And we have to ask all of those questions. And if we don't, we're a distracted parent. One last trouble spot that many parents come into, especially if you have multiple kids, is that you try to hit all the release points uniformly. That you do the same for every one of your kids, even though they're completely different. Every child gets their cell phone in the same year. Every kid gets the keys to the car at the same time. Every child goes off to college when they turn 18. If we try to be uniform at all the release points, we negate the fact that God has made them individuals. Well, hey, enough coaching, enough from me for sure. Hopefully some of those observations are helpful, but I know what we're about to share is going to be helpful because it's from God's word. I want to take you to Proverbs chapter 4. Solomon wrote a lot of the Proverbs that we have in Scripture today. One of the things that I appreciate about the Proverbs is that they're all about how to get wisdom and how to transfer wisdom. Solomon most often writes from a multi-generational format. He talks about his parents, he talks about his generation, and he talks about his kids' generation. Well, Proverbs 4 is an example of that. I want to begin by reading just the first few verses. And as we do that, I want you to take note of the three generations as they appear. Let's go to the text. Proverbs chapter 4, it says, "Listen, my son." So there's one generation. "To a father's instruction." That's two generations. "Pay attention, gain understanding. I give you sound learning. So do not forsake my teaching." Why? Because it didn't start with me. Notice what he says. "For I too was a son to my father, still tender and cherished by my mother." He's saying that I learned what I'm sharing with you from my parents when I was just a small child. Here's a great principle for us when it comes to transferring wisdom, especially during times of transition. Wisdom is built over generations, not in a generation. Let me also say that the primary goal of parenting is not to just become a good advice giver. And the role of your child is not to just become a good advice taker. The primary goal of parenting, hear me on this, parents, the primary goal of parenting is not to get them attached to you and to your advice, but to get them attached to the process of gaining and applying wisdom. I want to press on with the next paragraph of our text, and I want you to take note of two things. He talks about where wisdom comes from and how it's transferred. That's the first thing. And then the second thing is the rewards that come to someone who practices wisdom. So as we read through this, you'll be looking for those two things. Here we go. Getting wisdom is the wisest thing you can do. I love that. Whatever else you do, develop good judgment. Learn how to make wise decisions, right? If you prize wisdom, and now he's going to pour on some of these rewards, she will make you great. He's personalized the concept of wisdom. She will make you great. Embrace her. She will honor you. She will place a lovely wreath on your head. She will present you with a beautiful crown. You'll be honored. You'll have position and real power in life. My child, listen to me. Do as I say, and you'll have a long, good life. I will teach you wisdom's ways and lead you in straight paths. I'm going to help you understand where wisdom comes from and how it's transferred. When you walk, you won't be held back. When you run, you won't stumble. Take hold of my instructions. Don't let them go. Guard them, for they are the key to life. That's amazing. What an amazing, amazing truth about how wisdom is transferred from one generation to the other and what the rewards are for wisdom. Now, I'm sure those who are listening to this video, there are some great parents out there, and your advice is stellar, and you're probably great at transferring that advice to your kids, but that's not the point, right? The primary goal of parenting is to help them fall in love with the process of making wise decisions, of utilizing good judgment. So I don't want to spend a lot of time that remains in this message talking about the specific advice that we ought to give. I want to talk about the kind of checkpoints along the way of transition, along the way of development. And as we get to those specific transition points, what are the pieces of wisdom that we need to have transferred? So this is more of a wisdom calendar. By this stage or this transition point, that we need to have transferred this wisdom. And by this transition point, another batch of wisdom. Follow where I'm going? So let's talk about wisdom's calendar. We want to divide life for our children up into what I'll call zones. So let's start with the first zone, which is the school zone, right? This is kind of the first major transition point where they head off to school or to preschool. What wisdom needs to have been transferred by the time they get to the school zone? Well, they need to know how to begin and grow a relationship with Jesus. They may not have made that faith decision yet, but they need to understand what that decision is and that it's a necessary decision. They need to understand where our family values come from, that we base it on God and His Word. They need to have a clear understanding of right and wrong. So if you're looking for some checkpoints before they go to school, that's it. So in the school zone, that's the download that needs to have taken place. Let's go to the next life stage, which is what I'll call the change zone. I believe the biggest change for any child is when they enter into the junior high years, the middle school years. That's so critical. Everything changes for them. Physically, they got changes going on. Relationally, emotionally, spiritually. In every way, their life is in the middle of a change zone. So in the midst of a change zone, what's the wisdom that needs to have been downloaded? They need to understand and have confidence in the love and acceptance of their parents, that no matter what anyone else says to them in middle school, no matter what else or what other mistake they may make, that their parents are going to love and accept them. They need to have a clear understanding of their sexual identity, and they need some preparation for the fact that in middle school is when all the sexual temptation and sexual pressures begin. They need to be ready for that. And I would also add, they need to have a basic grid for self-direction. I mean, they don't need the whole package, but they need to know the basics of it. If mom and dad aren't here, What are the basic guidelines or principles around which they make decisions so that your middle schooler can make those decisions? The next life stage is what I call the freedom zone, right? This is from 16 to 18 years old. They're getting a cell phone, they're getting a car, they're getting a lot of freedom. What's the wisdom that they need to have gotten by that point? Well, they need a complex grid for self direction. I mean, they need the whole GPS for life. They need to know uh, how to use a pros and cons list. They need to know the importance of getting outside counsel before they make a decision. They need to know that you test a decision before you try a decision. They need to know the importance of consequences related to decisions that we make. They need the whole GPS tool for life. Secondly, they need a fully developed personal accountability system. They need to have transferred from accountability to you to self governance. They need to be self controlled and then establish some sort of functional communication with parents. What do I mean by that? Well, when they crash the car, when they fail a class, or they flunk a semester at college, uh, when they make a misstep sexually, are they able to talk to you about those things without you flipping out? Do they know that when they get in trouble, they run to their dad and their mom, not away from them? That's what I'm talking about here. Last one is what I call the celebration zone. This is when they launch for real. This is when they go into adulting, they go into the marketplace, they get married. That ought to be a huge time of celebrating all that's been accomplished. What do they need to know when it comes to wisdom by then? They need to have peer relationships with their parents and with their siblings. They need to have healthy communication with their parents. They have to know that they understand how wisdom works when it comes to the biggest life choices they're ever going to make, where to work, who they're going to marry, how to raise their kids. All those decisions, they need to understand how wisdom works there. And they need to have a real hunger for counsel and the humility to ask for it. Well, hey, if we can get all of that accomplished, what are the rewards? Well, I want to go back to the text as we wrap it up here. And let's just walk through 4 rewards. If we can transfer wisdom and if they can live out that wisdom, 4 great things are going to happen. First of all, they're going to be honored, right? We always love those honoring ceremonies when they go middle school or high school or college, and they have honor conferred on them for their accomplishments, right? How did Solomon say it in Proverbs 4? It says, if you prize wisdom, she will make you great. Embrace her, and she will honor you. The second reward after honor is this. They get a good, long life. Isn't that what we want for our kids? Yeah, we want them to have a great life and a long life. Solomon said it this way: my child, listen to me and do as I say, and you will have a long, good life. Wow. So great. So important to me now as a grandparent. They're going to have fewer scars. That's number 3. Fewer scars. They're going to have less turbulence in their life. They're going to have less obstacles to overcome. Solomon said it this way: when you walk, you won't be held back. When you run, you won't stumble, if you apply wisdom. One last reward, and it's probably the longest lasting and the best one. It's this: true fulfillment. Solomon said it in these words: take hold of my instructions, don't let them go, guard them, for they are the key to life. Talking about abundant life. Jesus said, I've come that you might have life and that you might have it abundantly. And that abundant life is tied to the application of wisdom. So, parents, understand what stage you're in. Understand what wisdom has to be transferred. And then commit yourself to hitting those checkpoints with grace. And your child will be the beneficiary of all these great rewards. Hey, love you so much. Know this: God loves you even more. Can't wait to see you here at Bay Life next week.